Hello and welcome to the Corolosophy Podcast. This is episode 143, Toward a Diversity of Diversities, with survey results from you and from some folks in a live audience with me back in January. This episode is a pastiche of sorts from several sources. In fact, several audio sources as well. If I sound weird to you right now, it's because I am on spring break and I am recording in an office in a timeshare rental with my Rode kit. So I'm using a microphone that's not quite the quality that the one I'm used to and the one you are used to. And there will be live presentation audio here in this episode. There will be some from my home studio and some from this source that you're hearing right now. So I apologize. We will start with the introduction from my Togetherness Activism presentation. This was a live presentation from Colorado in January. In that segment, I tell the story of what I have learned about discourse and discussion from starting a podcast 4 years ago, where my opinion becomes out there, becomes public. I don't have the luxury anymore of deciding that I'm just not going to talk about that in public because I don't want the trouble. I don't really have that luxury anymore. And in fact, I've gotten over that. So I get to tell that story a little bit. Some of those experiences have been very gratifying in putting those conversations out there. Some have been frustrating, some have been fun, and some have been stressful. But in all situations, I have learned so much, and I've actually changed my opinion about many things. One of the things I've learned is how oversimple our understanding of each other can be due to these online interactions. During this presentation, I launched a survey to the audience where, in person, we are able to see and explore the ways in which we might be diverse beyond what we can see. Over the next few weeks, I plugged the survey in every choir director group I could and got a nice sample size of responses, and I will be discussing those responses here as well. This is a fun and varied discussion that I hope stimulates more conversation. This show just doesn't happen without the folks over at Patreon. Patreon.com/Corolosophy is a subscription service for a free podcast. Why would someone do this? Well, they appreciate the work that it takes to put on this show at a high production value every single week. This is folks that decide they want to chip in. $3 a month gets you in the door for all the extra materials and private podcasts there. So go to patreon.com/Corolosophy and get signed up today. The producers at Patreon are Brian Long, Chandler Smith, Venture Studios, John Warner, Jonah Clixbull, Ulrika Igrain Munoz Alarcon, Angie Schilling, David Kowalczyk, James Mock, Jared Hendricks, Kyle Peterson, Max Jackson, Michael Herron, Nathan Hines, Ryan Main, and Stephen Kathy Kakacha.
Welcome back to the stage, Chris Wentz. So, as in the other presentations that I've done the last couple days, I would encourage you, if you can come from the way back, I think you'll enjoy this one better, but I'm not going to be mad about it. I'm going to start this presentation with a story. This is a small group, and I was telling my wife on the way here, in fact, what did I say on the way here about this session? You weren't paying attention, were you?
No, I was. That you wanted to have everyone sit in a circle?
No.
Oh.
You definitely were not paying attention.
I said that. Okay.
So what I said, what I had said is I actually kind of am hoping for a smaller group for this next session because.
I remember that now.
Yeah, because I designed this one to be a little bit more conversational than the other ones that we've been doing. And I also know when we go to professional development conferences and when I present at professional development conferences, people want the practical hands-on stuff. So the story I'm going to tell, related to why I chose to finish with this session, knowing that it would be less popular than my practical hands-on ones, is because the philosophy of why we do what we do is incredibly important and rarely bantered about and back and forth outside of higher ed, right? So we have to write papers in undergrad of why we're going to become a music teacher or whatever it is. And I can promise you that answer that you write when you're an undergrad is not the answer you have now if you've been teaching for a while. In fact, I hope it isn't. I hope that your perspective on why you do your job 10, 15, 20 years, whatever down the road is not still what you wrote when you're a 19-year-old undergrad, right? So I wanted to have a chance to kind of talk about some of the things that I've noticed in the way that we discuss our profession and the way that we discuss our philosophies. So I think the best way to do that is to start with a story. So of course in February of 2019, I started the Choreolosophy podcast, and I started putting my opinions about stuff on the internet. And then very quickly, it became apparent to me that this is a badly needed thing. Because when I started teaching, and we've got some young folks up here in the front, when I started teaching, the way you would discuss your hows and your whys and your reasons behind teaching and your philosophies behind why you entered the classroom in the first place and what your outcomes for students would be, all of those conversations happened at conventions and bars. They weren't online. They weren't in front of everyone. They were human to human, eyeball to eyeball. And somebody could sit down and talk to me about the thing that they believe in doing, and I could be like, that is just totally ridiculous. But because I saw the human on the other side of that glass of wine, I was like, okay, we disagree about that, but let's part as friends, right? That has become a lot harder now, because our conversations don't happen that way. They happen with an audience. They happen publicly, okay? So I started the show in 2019, and of course at the beginning I was doing some really interesting work and having some interesting conversations right away, but it was brand new, nobody had heard about it, and not a whole lot of people were listening. But I enjoyed it. It was professional development for myself. I was getting to have really interesting conversations with a lot of people. And then COVID happened. And I posted an episode in May of 2020 in response to the ACDA webinar that cost people their jobs. Literally. ACDA created a webinar that was used as evidence by administrators to fire people. I got those emails almost immediately. And so I panicked because my profession was being, thrown on the New York Times as being one of the most dangerous things you could do. And so what I did, it's kind of an interesting thing. Again, keep in mind my show was not popular at that time. It had a decent following of a few hundred people. And I sent a Twitter direct message to a COVID expert that should not have responded to my message, but I was panicked. And I said, something's going on in the choir world right now that I don't think I think we're missing a whole bunch of stuff. And this is a guy I'd seen on MSNBC and Fox News and worked at Johns Hopkins in their infectious disease area. And so I sent him a message and I said, would you just please come and talk to me so I can try to spread some accurate information about what's going on? Not expecting a response. It was a panic message, okay? He wrote me back in 45 minutes. And he said, I've got 30 minutes for you between rounds at the hospital tomorrow. Can you be on at 11:30 or whatever it was? I took the day off from online school in May and set it up so that I could be there ready for him. So and this is where I'm starting with this story. That episode exploded, okay? It went viral, as you could say. I was even quoted in the New York Times from that episode. They linked to my website. It kept me up at night because of all the ding, 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 stuff going on. That put my show on the map, but it also let me know about something really, really important in the way that we were having conversations about things at that time. What I discovered was that if our opinions about a thing are not the same as each other's, the toxicity that happens when those opinions are discussed publicly changes the entire dynamic of the conversation to the point that I believe it is actually interrupting our ability to advocate for our art form, which is ultimately the art form of togetherness. Okay? And for me, I don't care what the preferred COVID policies of my students' parents were during the pandemic. They are just as welcome in my classroom, no matter what their parents' political beliefs are, no matter where they come from, no matter what their young adolescent developing philosophies of their own world perspectives are, means nothing to me when I'm deciding who is welcome in my space. So the problem I started noticing is, I'm a choir teacher, my opinions are public, other choir teachers have social media accounts too, their opinions are public. So if I decide to take dogmatic, judgmental, public positions on contentious issues, what happens to the feeling of welcome and the feeling of togetherness that is felt by the student, of the parents who disagree with my opinion? Am I preaching inclusion, or am I demonstrating inclusion? Because to me, only really one of those things makes a difference to the kids that walk into my classroom. Okay? They want to see it. And they also don't really want to see it with slogans. They don't want to see it. I mean, I'm all about, like, it's so fine to put, like, signs on your wall about how inclusive the space is. Like, guys, kids don't read stuff. They can see this stuff on the wall, but ultimately that's not what's going to sell them on whether or not your environment is welcoming and opening. It's going to be the relationships that you form with your students. And so I started noticing this as a problem, and I actually believe that it is potentially an existential threat to our profession. Is how we present ourselves in public when we don't agree. Okay? And it could be easily, somebody could be listening to this and have the opinion that I'm just being dramatic. Like I'm over worried about that. And that'd be fine, you could have that opinion. I feel very strongly that that's the case. Another one, of course, that has put me in the, right in the limelight of how these conversations have been happening are our conversations around race and culture. There are lots and lots of conversations that have the word inclusion in them, that the very first thing that happens in those conversations is we figure out who we're going to exclude. And that happens from inclusion-focused people all the time, all the time. And so one of the things that I've noticed, because I've published quite a bit of material on the intersection of race in choral music, a lot of conversations. And one of the things that I've discovered, again, through just having the platform that I have and having the opportunity to have the conversations with the people that I do, is here are two very common messages that I get. One, private messages always. Person in higher ed, thank you for having this conversation. This is a really important conversation. I can't support you publicly, ... Colleagues of color, frequently, thank you for talking about us like we're just normal people like everyone else. I can't support you publicly, but ... This has been my life for the last 2 years. Okay? And so I'm noticing that this is a problem because ultimately all of these issues come down to why are people all over the country and all over the world coming to me privately to say that they're afraid to talk about what they actually think? That's a problem. That is a problem. If we want to have the ability to present our profession as a together activity, we have to lead with that. We have to lead with openness, curiosity, the ability to say, I've never thought of it that way, as our first response. That's interesting. I think differently, but that's interesting. Why do you think that? Where did that come from? What experience did you have in your life that led you to think that? I think something very different, right? And that's okay. That's the idea. So I'm going to suggest a little activity for us today, if you're willing, and in just a second, because in the part of this story that I feel like is missing in our conversations about inclusion is that I feel like choirs are already better than most entities around the world, organizations, systems, whatever it is, at this stuff. We already are. It was cool 15 years ago to not program an entire concert of Brahms. It's natural to us because it's boring. Even if you had not a single social justice bone in your body, 20 years ago you weren't doing whole concerts at the high school level of Brahms and Beethoven. Okay? Because it's boring, and the kids don't want to do that. And so we've been doing that for a while. And I think what's important about pointing that out and why that matters is that if any desire to make change in a world is lying underneath your motivations, one of the most important things to convincing other people about your vision is pointing to something that is successful. if we can't talk about things that are going well in our push to change society for the better, then we're not going to win over people who are not already interested in that project. Why would someone join my cause if everything I point out to them is a critique? Because people want to join causes that they think they can succeed at, right? So if my vision for a better future is always looking to find out what I can poke holes at, then we have a little bit of a trouble in our our ability to advocate and convince people. It's rhetoric 101. Rhetoric 101. So I've set up a survey. If you are willing, and this is like, I'm going to look at the results of this right now. So I would really like it if everyone would fill it out. Don't worry, your results will be anonymous. Okay, so you get the idea. Now, what was the point of doing that? The point of doing that was that I personally have a real issue with the way that we talk about diversity. I believe very strongly that you can't judge diversity in a photograph. If I were to take a picture of a group of people and show it to you, I don't actually believe that you could tell whether or not that group of people in front of you is diverse in any meaningful way. Because ultimately, what is the point of advocating for diversity? In my mind, the point of wanting a more diverse landscape around us is outcomes, right? So that means that if I'm going to make the argument that my business or my school or whatever organization it is that I'm involved in would benefit from being more diverse, in real terms, why would we benefit from that? Well, we would benefit from that because different people with different ways of looking at the world and different life experiences behind them and different moral palettes and different priorities over what's important, those people would all meet the minds and they would come up with different ways of approaching and attacking whatever the issue is. Okay? The problem with photographic diversity, which is my coined term, okay, is that I could take a picture of a group that appears to be very diverse, and I could give them all that survey, and their answers would be the same. At which case, when it's time for us to meet our minds, we aren't. We aren't meeting minds, we're meeting like minds. We can't learn from like minds. We can only learn from people who are not like us. If that is the goal, is that better outcomes for our organizations, then we need to be able to consider diversity, as I call it on the show, in higher definition. There is more to diversity than immutable characteristics.
So from that point on in the presentation, I go on to discuss more about the concept of photographic diversity versus what I call more meaningful diversity. And those of us in the audience filled out the survey and we talked about some of the questions. But if you'd like to hear the rest of that presentation, that has been published already on the private podcast feed, which can be accessed by Patreon subscribers. For as little as $3 a month, you can go over to patreon.com/Coralosophy and subscribe there, and you'll get access right alongside your normal podcast feed. When you get the link there, you can have it populate in your podcast player, and you can hear all the private episodes. That full presentation, as well as a whole bunch of other private content, is there as well. So a really common response that I hear when I bring up this idea that diversity has to go deeper than immutable characteristics. It has to go deeper than the big 5 skin colors that were invented in about 1580 to justify slavery. We need to go deeper than that, and we also need to go deeper than immutable sex characteristics when we are talking about who gets to talk about stuff, whether or not their opinion is valid, and whether or not we are wanting to hear and discuss opinions about anything, really. In order for us to get what diversity claims to be able to offer us, we need to be able to go deeper than that. And so oftentimes when I'm having a good faith conversation about that, which is almost never on Facebook, it's always in person, someone will bring up intersectionality. So it sounds like you're talking about intersectionality. And I will, if I'm feeling like we're in a safe conversation, I will say, yes, kind of. It is kind of intersectionality to think about how all of our identities intersect to create unique experiences. But the problem with using intersectionality in that context is that if you keep doing that too much, you ultimately get to individuals. If you divide all the various identities that a person could either create for themselves or have placed upon them by society, you would arrive at every individual having unique experiences, which of course is true. So, to understand how intersectionality can be misused and misunderstood, I'm actually going to go directly to the person who invented intersectionality, and that is Kimberly Crenshaw. In a Time magazine article, she was asked very directly that and I'm going to read directly from the article here. The interviewer said, "You introduced intersectionality more than 30 years ago. How do you explain what it means today?" Her response was, and this is actually very important because I've read her papers and understand the concept pretty well. I'm not a scholar, but this is a really great answer. She said, "These days, I start with what it's not, because there has been distortion. It's not identity politics on steroids. It is not a mechanism to turn white men into new pariahs. It's basically a lens, a prism for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exacerbate each other. We tend to talk about race inequality as separate from an inequality based on gender, class, sexuality, or immigrant status. What's often missing is how some people are subject to all or some of these, and the experience is not just the sum of its parts." So, from this point, now you're hearing my opinion. That was her explanation, and I think she is dead on. The concept has been distorted into a concept where you can use the idea of intersecting identities to give someone power in a conversation dealing with individuals. Then you are misusing intersectionality. Intersectionality, like she says, is a prism for looking at society. It's a prism for looking at group averages. And because she did her work, her scholarly work, on large scale samples of people, in law in particular, in how Black women were treated by the legal system. That was the concept was invented that way. It is not designed to tell you anything about the person that you are talking to, about the individual person that you are talking about or to. And I hope people can understand the difference, right? And I think this is one of the things that I'm going to stick with Kimberly Crenshaw here real quick and go to her paper mapping the margins. And this is the paper in which she outlined in the 1990s intersectionality for the first time. When I criticize the way people use intersectionality as a concept, I am making an anti-essentialist argument. In other words, don't make the most important thing about the person their identity. Don't make that is to essentialize them, is that you know everything you need to know about me because I'm a white male. That's hugely problematic because no, you don't. I just like I don't know everything I need to know about you by looking at you either. I don't know everything I need to know by knowing your sexuality. Those things don't define us, and that we can't allow them to define us. So I am making anti-essentialist critiques. And here's what she says about that, because she actually warns about people like me in her paper. But because she's writing in good faith, this is what I believe anyway, that Kimberly Crenshaw was writing this concept and inventing this concept before we had politicized it in the way that we have now. The way she explains it is that people who are making these anti-essential arguments like I am should be distinguished from people who are making no room at all in the conversation for identity in politics, or identity politics as we oftentimes call it. Now, I've been very clear on the show that I think there is room for identity politics. In other words, there is room for talking about inequality based on race, inequality based on gender. Those things are totally fine to do. What's not fine to do is think that those conversations also transfer over to conversations that you were having with and about individuals, because in that case, you are misunderstanding the social science involved. That leads us directly to the survey that I gave during that presentation and from many choral directors since then. I have close to 200 responses, and if you're watching on the YouTube channel, I'm going to show you some of that. So, of course, my first disclaimer is that I am not a professional pollster, and this is not a scientific poll. However, I think it illustrates some points that I was trying to make earlier in that presentation in Colorado. And I'm going to put the link to this survey in the show notes. So if you'd like to add your input into the survey, that's fine. It's a free account, so at a certain point, the survey will shut down. I think there's probably room for another 20 or 30 people. So once that's full, it's full, because I don't want to be a professional pollster and pay for an account to do this. Okay, so let's dive in here. Ways in which we are diverse that you wouldn't be able to see, right? So if we lined everyone up in a room at a choir convention and we went beyond what we see in terms of skin, in terms of the way that we present to the world, in terms of our gender, etc. So of a couple hundred choral directors that were polled, how would you describe your relationship to religion? Moderately religious, very devout, agnostic, or atheist? 37% were moderately religious, 28% very devout, 24% agnostic, and 10% atheist. And that cuts across all of the other categories that I mentioned, so race and gender. I think that's a really good cross section. So just a little bit more than 1/4 gave each of those answers, right? So just a little bit off from that. Of course, the moderately religious are the biggest group, and the atheists are the smallest group amongst that amongst those surveyed. Now, here's where it gets a little bit more interesting. What is your political affiliation? And the choices were leans liberal, progressive, strongly liberal or progressive, moderate, strongly conservative, leans libertarian, or strongly libertarian. All right, so lots of choices here. I tried to run the entire gamut of how, at least in the US, we describe political valence. Now, for choral directors in the US, I would be interested in you, as you listen, before I tell you what the results of the survey were, what would you guess? Where do most choral directors fall? And I think this is no secret. In fact, I did an episode on this way back with Reginald Wright, which was a really good episode about whether or not the choral world is so heavily skewed to the left that sometimes it's hard for us to have conversations as if there are multiple perspectives, because we rarely encounter them. And this seems to back that up with some numbers. So of those choices, 34% were leans liberal or progressive, and 27% were strongly liberal or progressive. So if you put those two together, then you're looking at, 61%, or close to 2/3 of the ones surveyed. And I think that I would guess that that's actually probably pretty close. If you're being honest, because it's an anonymous survey, I think we're going to get in that realm of 2/3 to 70% in the liberal category, or the progressive category. And then you had 15% moderate, 8% strongly conservative, 8% leans conservative, and then another 8% total in the libertarian categories. So you've got these minorities then within the choral landscape that nobody sees. And I would also argue minorities within the choral landscape in terms of the way that they look at the world, that nobody asks them for their opinion. I will let you think about that and do with it what you will. But again, if the purpose of diversity is to bring different viewpoints to the table and ways of thinking about problems to the table, that could reveal a problem in our ecosystem. Here's another one. The question is, how many close relationships do you have with people who have different views from you politically? Now, we did better on this one than I was thinking we would, and so I'm proud of us. 34% said 7 or more relationships with people whose views differ from ours. Although the vast majority fell in the three or 4 or less category. So 2/3 of us fell in that category, where of all the people that we hang out with and have relationships with, 3 or 4 or less have, the way I phrased it, different views from you politically. And so I don't know, that's hard for me to vibe with, because my answer would have been like 50 plus. Like everybody I know has different views from me politically, because I'm weird. I disagree with everybody. Almost every political solution I've ever heard for any problem is just laughable to me. And so I realize that I'm an outlier in that category, but that was interesting to me. Now, I asked people to describe their race and ethnicity, and I don't have percentages here in front of me because I intentionally did not put race and ethnicity as a drop-down menu choice. I allowed people to type in their own. And as a result, I got tons and tons of different types of answers. Now, of course, if you listened to my episode 113 on Are We Doing Anti-Racism Wrong with Dr. Sheena Mason, you would probably know that I'm very much on the side. Another one of my controversial views that I hold makes me an outlier is that race is a social construct, and that means not only is it not real, but we cause harm when we act like it's real. And so I mentioned earlier the big five skin colors, right? So that's your red, white, brown, yellow, and black. So those are made up. Those are not a real thing. They are not categories in any kind of meaningful biological way. They are political categories. The vast majority of people that filled out this form identified in some way as a category that we would call white. I did have quite a bit of other non-white people, though. And of course, I would say, just scrolling through the list here, it's similar to the American population, had probably 30% non-white people. But then you get into the interesting responses like Caucasian versus white, or Native American versus like biracial, like Middle Eastern, see other ones. And then people who really understood the assignment, like German and French Canadian, which are ethnicities, whereas white is not an ethnicity, black is not an ethnicity, brown is not an ethnicity. So we conflate a lot of these terms. And so mostly I put that in there because I was interested to see how people would respond. And because I think we're just so steeped in the language of this. I see black, and then I also see black hyphen or slash African American. These are very common ways that people use for example, another way I would illustrate this. If anyone's ever done 23andMe, when you get your 23andMe results back, what do you get? Do you get percent black? Do you get percent white? Do you get percent yellow? No, of course you don't, because that would be ridiculous. Yet, when we're asked to identify ourselves, that's how we identify, which is just an interesting thing. I don't think it's a good idea, but it's so normal for people that I don't pass any judgment. I'm not trying to scold anybody. That's just me thinking out loud. Okay, so then the next question. How do you perceive racism in choral music education? The choices are: the history of racism and its effect in our field is undeniable, but things have gotten and continue to get better. Music education is still a racist field. Non-white people have major disadvantages and face discrimination regularly. Music education is a primarily non-racist, anti-racist field, and everyone is included and welcome. I'd be interested in having you try to make a guess here. What was the most common answer? Before I reveal it, and you can do that as I'm talking here, but about 2/3 of us in that poll, and I would put myself in this majority group as well, chose that the history of racism and its effect in our field is undeniable, but things have gotten better and continue to get better. And I think that that's a really important framing and understanding as we acknowledge things that have happened in the past, while also acknowledging success, because you've got to acknowledge success if you want to get people inspired to keep working. That's just human psychology 101. So that was 2/3 of everyone. 1/4, or 25%, were in the music education is still racist, still to this day, disadvantages, discrimination category. And then only 14% chose that we are primarily a non-racist, anti-racist field. Now, again, you could quibble with those questions, and I understand that. I've had that conversation with some people already. There's different ways you could frame that. There's different choices you could make. But I think the point is to illustrate that not everybody thinks about this topic the same way. And oftentimes, if we're in a room full of people who might have varying skin colors, like I said before, or varying gender presentations, that you just don't know unless you have a conversation where they stand on these types of things. So I gave you the opportunity to answer these questions anonymously, and then suddenly we get a different picture than we might get, say, at an ACDA convention from looking down the list of topics. Then I asked people also to type in how they describe their sexuality and their gender. Also, not from a drop-down menu, because I'm more interested in how people describe themselves. And here, man, we ran the gamut. And I think probably because we get, uh, you know, uh, anonymous, then suddenly we're a little bit brave. So we have things like um, lots of straight male, lots of straight female. There's some people who choose to use the word hetero male, cis hetero male, cisgender male. One person said gay, but they don't like to flaunt the identity. That's interesting. And then, yeah, it's just other choices here. Just some are female. I'm scrolling through here. He, him pronouns is another way people chose to describe it. Female, born that way and won't ever change. That's interesting. Okay, heterosexual, cisgender female. One person said straight, and I would not describe my gender expression. Demisexual, biromantic, gender fluid, femme presenting is another way someone chose to describe. So again, I'm a man married to a woman, transgender male, attracted to women, bi. So there's the heterosexual. Now it's interesting because I see more variation here in how people are describing themselves in terms of sex and gender in than there is in terms of the racial category. So lots less variance in how people describe themselves, the language. A very high percentage of the people on the race question used the big five letter colors. I do think that that's just interesting and worth. Oh, good. This is good. One person put Nunya beeswax, and I agree. This was for science people. I'm trying to just get an idea of what's out there. Now, staying on the gender topic here, the next question: how should we handle gendered language in addressing or communicating with groups? Now, this one I think might anger some people, or at least be a wake-up call. I hope it doesn't anger anyone because it shouldn't. Um, I've asked this poll. Now, I've done this question in several Facebook groups and got very similar results every time. So this one carries a little bit larger of a sample size. And the question is, how should we handle gendered language in addressing or communicating with groups? The choices are, again, you could quibble with how many choices there could be here. You could ask different questions, etc. But the ones I asked were, we should work to be more sensitive with how we use it, meaning gendered language, considering the people in the room. Another choice is eliminate it, all gender neutral language all the time with our ensembles. So the question is about with our groups, right? And then the third choice is it's not a big issue. Use gendered language if that's what you're used to. Okay, so the majority answer by a lot also would be my answer, which is work to be more sensitive with how we use it and consider the people in the room. I've made that argument on the show before. I'm taking a little bit of heat from it, especially in episode 141 about masculinity. That was interesting. So the percentage there is 73%. That's the biggest separation in any of the polling questions, was on this question. 73% of respondents put themselves in the we should be more sensitive in how we use it and considering the people in the room. Whereas only 16% were in favor of eliminating all gender neutral language when talking to groups. And I just point that out because that perspective, though, is the one you would think is the majority perspective when you look at the public conversation about this. And luckily, because I disagree with this one strongly, luckily only 11% said it's not a big issue. I do think that just anytime you're talking about being sensitive to other people's needs and emotions in your classroom or your choir, it's a big issue. So I think we should be sensitive to those things, and I'm glad that that was the most common answer. Next, I feel like I fit in around other choir directors and can be authentically myself in public, not worrying what my colleagues think of me. Now, this one, the choices were mostly, yes, no, and rarely. 55% said mostly. Only 28% said yes. Okay, so then the no's and the rarely's totaled 18%. And so I think the takeaway here is that only about a quarter of us feel this way all the time. Only about a quarter of us feel like we can walk into our choir spaces and just be ourselves. I think that would be something that we should all just reflect on, and whether or not you are the drama. Like I try to ask myself that a lot. Am I the drama here? Am I the one creating that environment for others? Because I would love to see that yes answer be more like 55, 60%. That would be a sign of health in our landscape. Okay, lastly, describe your social circle. And this one, we did really well on this one, I think, because this is healthy. The choices were a balance of choir people and educators, as well as people from other professions, mostly fellow choir people and educators, no colleagues, choir people or educators, and entirely colleagues. 78%, so almost 80%, chose that or described themselves as having a balance of choir people and educators, as well as other people from other professions in their social circle. Now, that's really healthy, and I think that that's awesome. So again, I will post the link to this survey so the first few people to come to it can still add their perspective here. There's enough answers now where the percentages won't change too much, but I would love to have a larger sample size for whenever. So I would love it if you have not filled it out yet to please go do that. Now, again, going to tie a bow on this of what the point of this exercise was. It was simply to help us picture that underneath, for lack of a better term, underneath the skin of the people around us in a room could potentially be such a wide range of perspectives on all these questions, but probably 100 other questions that you might find interesting that you could ask people and get a wide range of answers. And then my other point, of course, was to show that if you arranged a group of people that looked very diverse and you asked them all these questions or whatever 100 other questions you wanted to ask them, and you got all the same types of answers, that would be a problem also. So it is important for us to think about diversity along multiple matrices, and multiple ways of measuring. And that includes the things that make us tick under the hood, so to speak. So I hope this was interesting, and it could be, if this is something that just is scratching the surface of what needs to be asked to people, of what needs to be explored about how we are and who we are, then let me know that as well. Of course, you can go to the Choral Facebook page and you can start up a conversation about this. You can ask questions about any of the particular items on the survey. You can suggest things for future surveys, because I could do this again. That would be really fun. Maybe like a yearly check-in or something like that. So thank you for listening to me dig through these numbers, and I hope you found them thought-provoking. So for those of you who are newer to the Choralosophy podcast audience, and that would be most of you, the show started in February 2019, and so over 4 years old now. You may or may not remember episode 9. Episode 9, I even then felt the need to get on and do an episode just about how I was going to try to deal with people who disagree with me and or my guests on the internet. Because even after posting my first, in fact, it was my 8th episode, it only took 8 episodes for me to get called or have it implied that I was racist, because I think kids should learn, if they've never learned to sing before, I think classical voice lessons are a really good place for them to start. It teaches them a lot of those basic how to get your vocal folds to touch concepts that if they have another musical cultural background where they're already singing fluently, well, that's different. But if you're trying to get a kid to sing for the very first time, singing is not part of their culture. Singing is not part of their upbringing, their background. Then I advocate for classical voice lessons for kids in almost every case. It helps for choir as well, for obvious reasons. Well, I had figured out 8 episodes in that people who had not listened to the episode were going to see an advertisement for that episode and start calling me names and start questioning my positionality in order to make that comment. I heard comments after that 8th episode about how it's easy for me to think that that's a good idea as a white teacher who teaches mostly white rich kids, which of course is not even true, but that was the assumption that was made about me at that time, and flat out just people jumping onto Facebook posts and spewing stuff that they have no idea what they're talking about. And it was all based on their reaction to an opinion that wasn't their own opinion. And I noticed this right away, and I said people's instinct is not to react to that disagreement with a question of like, well, why do you think that? What led you to that conclusion? And of course, in many cases, I might have to say, well, just go listen to the podcast because I already laid all this out there, right? But oftentimes, the people that find that knee-jerk reaction as their first reaction are not the type who would go listen to a podcast anyway. So I figured out right away that this is not my target audience. And ever since then, I have been, as a way to continue to draw audience members in, been starting conversations on social media. Not too long ago, I posted this. So I had gone onto Twitter and I had tweeted the following, and I'll read it verbatim. In quotes, I tweeted, "Change how you speak because I'm offended." And, quote, "I won't change how I speak because you're offended," are both narcissistic postures. Life on a planet with 8 billion other people is a negotiation. Now, I stand by every word of that because I know what I meant by that. What I meant by that was really encapsulated, I think, pretty well in that tweet. And I think that one of the reasons I know that it was pretty well articulated, not perfectly, but pretty well articulated, is that across all the social media platforms that I posted on, I got several hundred positive responses. People resonated with that because I think what they're seeing is that I'm acknowledging in that quote that it is sometimes from a position of I am concerned about myself and I am only considering my perspective when we try to become censorious of other people's language. In other words, you can't say that. Or using institutional power, cancellation power, dogpiling power, petitioning an organization to stop using certain types of language is a narcissistic posture. And what I, of course, didn't mean by that is I'm calling any particular people narcissists. I would think that if you felt called a narcissist by that, then that might be one of those shoe fits, you wear it kind of situations. And sure, maybe somebody could have felt attacked by that. But that is a position that suggests to me, when people do that, it suggests to me that they have not wrapped into their thinking the concept that my way of thinking about that language is not the only way of thinking about that language. There are tons of turns of phrases and words and vocabulary that, depending on where and when you learned the language, could mean very, very different things to different people. And so my suggestion is that the non-narcissistic approach is to first say, how could this person understand that phrase differently than I do? And how could I communicate to them that I was offended or hurt by that in a way that doesn't come off as me placing my opinions about those words onto that other person? Okay, that's what that means. Then on the other side of that, the person who won't change what they are saying at all, because once they've found out that they've hurt somebody's feelings or that they have offended someone, is also a narcissistic posture. That is to look at the world and say, my interpretation of these words is the one that you must endure, because these are mine and I will not sacrifice them at all, even though I have found out that I have hurt your feelings. So again, both of these are kind of a-hole moves, right? And so then the last part of that is life on a planet with 8 billion other people is a negotiation. I feel pretty good about that. Of course, on Twitter, I did not pay for the unlimited characters thing that Elon Musk is making us pay for. So I'm still trying to fit my thoughts into these 280 character boxes. And so, of course, some of the criticism that came along on that post, it's on my personal Facebook page if you want to go check it out, related to all of the things that I could have said or meant, or what about this scenario, or what about that scenario, or what about the first one that started drawing all their friends into the play was, what about marginalized people, saying that, is it narcissistic for marginalized people to stick up for themselves? And of course, none of that is in there. People who read that into it, I think, are responsible for their own reading of what I posted. Right? Because they missed that the other half of that is that other people should be sensitive to those views. Okay? But because the premises of people who come onto my post are not always something that I'm going to agree with, then it really, really pissed people off. And it like kind of diluted and got all the way down to the point where, for multiple people, I was told to shut up because a white man doesn't need to be talking as much as I talk. That my opinions are harmful, and that I should stop putting them on the internet, right? So, of course, this is not a complaint. I think it's hilarious. I think it's adorable, actually, that people think that they could come onto my Facebook page and get me to stop posting. Like, I do this for a job, right? So that's just not going to happen. But it just played exactly into the pattern that I've been pointing out now for 4 years, which is that instead of coming to a post that rubs you the wrong way with curiosity and wanting to have a conversation, people are coming in with the idea that they're going to put this other person in their place, and then not able to handle it if I stick up for myself, right? Because I'm only sticking up for myself because I'm a white man. And that's just what white men do. They just, roll over people. I would be remiss if I didn't mention in this 150 comment deep Facebook thread on my personal page, everybody who seemed to have a really strong issue with me posting my opinion and how dangerous my opinions were, and essentializing me based on my race and gender. All of those people have been invited to come onto the show to talk to me about these things and about why they see me as so dangerous. I should mention that. None of them accepted that invitation. In fact, I was made fun of by them for asking. Just thought I'd throw that out there. Thank you as always for listening. Don't forget, on the way out, the best ways for you to help the show are to keep the conversations going, to join the Patreon at patreon.com/Coralosophy, and to use the promo codes at sightreadingfactory.com every time you sign up you and your kids for a membership, at Graphite Publishing and RyanMaine.com every time you go sheet music shopping, and at mymusicfolders.com every time you get the music folders for your choirs, choir robes at mychoirrobes.com, and of course you can go to coralosophy.com/Voce-Vista to download Voce Vista, and you can get a discount with the same code Coralosophy at all those websites will get you a discount. And ultimately, I'm just glad you're here. So thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.